Let's talk about one of the most quoted speeches in American history, and one I'm sure you heard a lot over the weekend, or I hope you did. Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," delivered on July 5th, 1852. Because I think that what people still miss about the speech is what Douglass was really doing. Because to even give that speech, let alone have it heard, he had to step onto something of a rhetorical minefield. He wasn't just challenging slavery. He was navigating a national mythology so thick, so sacred, that to reject it outright would have ensured silence, would have made sure that no one would have paid any attention to him. So this is about how Douglass used the only language white Americans allowed him, and how he then used that language against him. Hey folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm an historian of the United States and the American Revolution, and the author of the forthcoming A Resistance History of the United States. The opening of Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech, it feels oddly reverent. Douglass calls the founders brave men, praises the saving principles of the Declaration, and uses a famous, important metaphor. The Constitution is a glorious liberty document, the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. Notice it doesn't say our, your nation's destiny. But it almost reads like a celebration. It isn't. It's the same Douglass who 3 years later in My Bondage and My Freedom calls those same founders slaveholders and traffickers in the bodies and souls of men, men who could not stand up to the simple claims of justice. That's not to think of it as rhetorical inconsistency. It's a clear strategy. In 1852, Douglass was addressing a mostly white, northern, civic-minded audience in Rochester, New York. And in the public sphere of 1852, the founders weren't just respected, they were holy. The revolution wasn't history, it was gospel. So he had to speak that language, he had to preach that gospel, because he understood a truth we still don't teach. The Patriot myth had become the national religion. And that religion had a priest, George Bancroft. By 1852, Bancroft, whose idea of history was created by the German Romantic nationalists, we could talk about that, had published, I think, 7 volumes of his history of the United States. The sprawling account of how America fits into divine destiny, particularly focusing on the American Revolution. He described the founders not just as flawed men, or not at all as flawed men, but as instruments of God, of providence. He claimed the American Revolution was the consecration of reason in human affairs. And Bancroft's influence cannot be overstated. We're still seeing it and hearing it and feeling it today. His books were treated as historical scripture, which has now fueled popular culture after World War II. His version of the revolution saturated school books in the 19th century, 4th of July sermons, children's readers, and the political rhetoric of Whigs and Democrats alike. So by the time Douglass rose to speak in Rochester in 1852, Bancroft's founding myth had already taken over the national imagination. And that myth demanded that all public arguments conform to it, even those that opposed slavery. And it's so powerful that it still shapes American historical consciousness today. We can go down the list, particularly when it comes to Christian nationalism and white nationalism. And that's what Douglass was up against. But the speech, it really begins in the middle, when you're reading it or when you're listening to it. After the mythic nods to the revolution, he pivots. "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." And from there, he just dismantles the very legacy that he just invoked. He declares the national celebration a sham, calls the founders' principles flagrantly violated, and reminds his audience, and this is where it hits, there is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States. That's your first republic. That's its epitaph. There's no more flattery. There's no more myth. The rest of the speech is a controlled demolition. And the power of that demolition rests on the fact that Douglass first spoke in the audience's native language before exposing it as a fraud. He's in the temple overturning the tables of the money changers. But he never spoke that way again. As the years passed, especially after the Civil War, he abandoned any reverent framing of the founders. No, 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 no. In his 1876 oration in memory of Abraham Lincoln, which he delivered at the Freedmen's Monument, Douglass offered a final assessment of the founding generation. The founding fathers were great men, to be sure, but they were also great compromisers, especially on the question of slavery. Let's dig into that a little bit. In calling them great compromisers, I don't think that Douglass was praising their political flexibility. He wasn't referring to compromise as mutual respect or the American genius of deliberative democracy. I think he meant compromisers in the older, unflattering sense, those who exposed something to danger or disrepute for personal gain, those who sold out the republic's moral foundation to preserve their own wealth, comfort, and property and other human beings. They didn't compromise for America. They compromised America. And Douglass knew it. So by the 1880s, Douglass saw how limited rhetorical appeals to conscience had been, how playing the game of moving the needle, encouraging reform from within, of working within the comfort zone, don't turn them off, of white people had failed to achieve meaningful change, had failed to resist the constant abuse of authority that was the First Republic, just operating as it was intended. In memorializing John Brown, he said, "While I live, John Brown shall not be slandered. His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light." Taper being just a small candle. Douglass understood that moral clarity wasn't enough. Liberation didn't come from speeches that made white people feel better about themselves. It came from rupture, from sacrifice, from war, from the unmaking of the old order, from the destruction of the First Republic. Today, the same founding myth Douglass had to speak through in 1852 is not just with us. It's dominating how we approach the past and its relationship to the present. The current regime is doing exactly what the founders did, using patriotic exceptionalism to justify an exclusionary, authoritarian nationalism. And they're doing it with the full power of the state and its cultural collaborators. And it isn't just historical distortion. It's political infrastructure. And the language they're using? It's the language of Bancroft. The liturgy of the founders. The same script Douglass was forced to recite in 1852. The same one Lincoln had to dismantle to end slavery. The difference? Oh, now it's being used with full awareness to silence dissent, to erase memory, and define citizenship through whiteness, conformity, and loyalty to a myth. And that's the point. This was always what the founders had intended, folks. Their version of liberty was not universal. It was exclusionary by design. Their republic was built for property-owning white men and only them. Today's regime doesn't distort that vision, it fulfills it. So when critics today frame their resistance in the founders' language, when they say we must return to our founding ideals or the Constitution gives us the tools to fix this, they are already on the defensive. They're arguing from within the same system that was designed to exclude them. Douglass understood that. Eventually, Lincoln did too. So the question isn't whether we're living through a return to the founding. We are. That's making America great again. That's the point. The question is whether we'll keep pretending the founders left us the tools to fix this, or whether we'll finally admit that the founding is the crisis. So what do we do with the speech? What do we do with Douglass in 1852? Well, we remember that it's brilliant. We remember that it's also strategic. We remember that it was compelled. It was made necessary by a system that allowed no other language to be heard. And we remember that Douglass moved on. He stopped speaking the language of myth. He stopped trying to redeem the founders. He stopped trying to work comfortably through the audience. And he started building a new patriotism, rooted not in 1776, but in 1865 and beyond. That's the Douglass we need now. Because truth doesn't need myth to make it righteous. And resistance doesn't need permission from the past. It needs only our courage to break the spell, to disenthrall ourselves, so we can fight back on our terms, not theirs.